What happened next defied every law of physics that Harold understood and violated every safety protocol he had ever learned. His right hand caught the bottom rung of the locomotive's rear access ladder just as his truck began to fall behind, the engine finally succumbing to demands that exceeded its capabilities by several orders of magnitude. For a terrifying moment that lasted exactly 3 seconds, but felt like an eternity, Harold's feet dragged along the railroad ballast as he fought to get his left hand onto the ladder. The locomotive's massive wheels thundered just 18 inches away, and Harold could feel the suction created by the train's passage, trying to pull him under 51 cars of unstoppable steel. This was the moment when Harold's body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. 40 years of climbing onto moving locomotives had built muscle memory that transcended age, arthritis, and common sense. His left hand found the ladder rung, his feet found purchase on the bottom rail, and suddenly, Harold Thompson was hanging onto the back of a runaway train, traveling at 84 miles per hour through the Missouri countryside. The climb to the locomotive cab was 23 feet of vertical ladder, exposed to wind that tried to tear him loose with every foot of elevation. Harold climbed steadily, methodically, drawing on techniques he had learned from Iron Horse McKinnon decades earlier. Don't look down. Don't think about falling. Focus only on the next rung, the next handhold, the next small victory in a series of small victories that might add up to staying alive. Halfway up the ladder, Harold's heart began to protest the combination of physical exertion and pure terror. His chest tightened, his breathing became labored, and for a moment he wondered if he would die of a heart attack before he could reach the cab. But then Harold heard something that gave him strength, the sound of Iron Horse McKinnon's voice, as clear as if the old engineer were climbing beside him. Pain is temporary, boy, but regret lasts forever. You climb because people need you to climb. You keep going, because stopping means everyone else stops with you. Harold climbed. When he reached the locomotive cab door, Harold paused for exactly 5 seconds to catch his breath and prepare for what came next. Inside that cab was either salvation or disaster, success or failure, the validation of the 67-year-old who stopped a runaway train that would reach the city center in less than 15 minutes. 2 million people watched their televisions in terror, many already evacuating, knowing that when 50 cars of industrial chemicals derailed at high speed, the explosion would level everything within a 5-mile radius. Welcome to True Hero Stories, where the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary places. I'm your host, and before I tell you how Harold saved 2 million lives, I need you to understand exactly who he really was. Because without that knowledge, what he did next will seem absolutely impossible. Hit that subscribe button right now, because you're going to want to see how this story ends. And trust me, you won't see the twist coming. It all started on a quiet Tuesday morning when the ground began to shake. Harold Thompson had been keeping a secret for 3 years, but it wasn't shame that kept him quiet. It was a promise. The kind of promise that changes a man's life forever, that haunts his dreams and shapes every decision he makes. But to understand that promise, you need to know about the day that defined Harold's entire career. The day that made him swear he would never let another train disaster happen on his watch. The day that prepared him for what was about to unfold in Springfield. It was October 15th, 1983. Harold was just 29 years old, a junior railroad inspector with the federal government, eager to prove himself and make a difference. He'd been assigned to investigate a locomotive malfunction in rural Pennsylvania. Routine paperwork, or so he thought. That's where he met James Iron Horse McKinnon, a 64-year-old locomotive engineer who had been working the rails for 47 years. McKinnon was legendary among railroad workers, the man who could feel a train's heartbeat, who could predict mechanical failures days before they happened, who had never had a single accident in nearly 5 decades of service. But McKinnon was dying, lung cancer from decades of diesel fumes and coal dust, and he had chosen Harold to be his final apprentice. "Boy," McKinnon had said in his gravelly voice, "you've got book learning, but books don't save lives. Experience saves lives, and I'm going to teach you things they don't put in manuals." For 6 months, until the day McKinnon died, Harold learned secrets that only a handful of men in America possessed. How to read a locomotive's behavior by the vibration in your feet. How to predict catastrophic failures by the pitch of an engine's rhythm. How to stop unstoppable trains using techniques that railroad companies kept classified. And on his deathbed, McKinnon made Harold promise something that would haunt him for the next 40 years. "Promise me," McKinnon had whispered, his voice barely audible, "that you'll never walk away from a train in trouble. Promise me that when people need saving, you'll be the one who saves them. Promise me you'll carry what I've taught you until the day you die." Harold had promised, and for 40 years he had kept that promise. He had prevented the Ohio chemical spill that would have poisoned 12 million people. He had stopped the Montana passenger train carrying 800 tourists from careening off a mountain cliff. He had saved the Nevada nuclear waste transport from derailing in a residential area. Each time, Harold had used McKinnon's forbidden knowledge. Each time, he had risked his career, his safety, and his life. Each time, he had kept his promise to a dying man who had believed that some responsibilities transcend job descriptions. But after 40 years of keeping that promise, Harold thought his days of train rescues were over. He thought he had earned the right to a quiet retirement, to a peaceful life organizing hardware and helping customers find the right screws. He was wrong, because on this Tuesday morning in Springfield, Missouri, a promise made to a dying legend was about to be tested one final time. And Harold Thompson was about to discover that some promises are so powerful they can turn ordinary men into heroes even when they think their heroic days are behind them. Tuesday morning arrived in Springfield like any other, but Harold's internal clock was off. He had been awake since 4:30 a.m., stirring restlessly from a dream he couldn't quite remember. Something about Iron Horse McKinnon, something about a promise, something that left him with a strange sense of anticipation that he couldn't shake. By 6:45 a.m., Harold was dressed and ready for work, a full hour earlier than usual. He stood in his kitchen, drinking coffee from Margaret's favorite mug, the one with the faded roses that she had bought at an antique shop in Pennsylvania during their honeymoon 43 years ago. The mug was one of the few things Harold had kept when he moved to Springfield, one of the few physical reminders of the life he had built with the woman who had understood his calling better than he understood it himself. Margaret had never asked Harold to choose between his dangerous work and their marriage. She had simply accepted that her husband was the kind of man who couldn't walk away from people in trouble, even when helping them meant risking everything he held dear. She had kissed him goodbye on countless mornings, never knowing if she would see him again, never complaining about the late-night phone calls that would send him racing toward another crisis. "Your gift isn't just knowing about trains," Margaret had told him once, after Harold had returned from a particularly dangerous rescue in Colorado. "Your gift is caring more about strangers than you care about your own safety. That's what makes you extraordinary." Now, standing alone in his small kitchen, Harold wondered if Margaret's ghost was trying to tell him something. The restless energy, the early waking, the inexplicable sense that something important was about to happen. It all felt familiar, like the calm before storms he had learned to recognize during his years of crisis response. Harold shook his head, dismissing the feeling as the imagination of an old man who missed his wife, and perhaps missed the excitement of his former career more than he cared to admit. He finished his coffee, locked his house, and drove to Murphy's hardware store, arriving at 7 a.m. sharp. The building was quiet, morning sunlight streaming through the large front windows and casting geometric patterns across the concrete floor. Harold had always loved this time of day at the store, the peaceful hour before customers arrived, when he could organize inventory and prepare for whatever small crises the day might bring. He unlocked the doors, turned on the lights, and began his routine of checking overnight deliveries and organizing the parts that customers had special ordered. There was something deeply satisfying about this work, something that reminded Harold of the best parts of his railroad career without the weight of life and death responsibility. At 7:43 a.m., Harold was in the back room, checking a shipment of pipe fittings against the inventory list, when he felt it. A vibration. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, the kind of tremor that most people would dismiss as a passing truck or construction equipment. But Harold's trained senses recognized something different in the frequency, something that made him set down his clipboard and stand perfectly still. The vibration came again, stronger this time, rhythmic and mechanical. Harold felt it through the soles of his feet, through the concrete floor, through 40 years of experience that had taught him to read the language of moving steel. "Train," he whispered to himself, then frowned deeply. The nearest active rail line was 8 miles outside Springfield, and Harold knew the schedules by heart. No freight trains were supposed to be running through this area during morning hours. The old B&O railroad corridor that curved around Springfield's eastern edge had been dormant for years, used only occasionally for equipment transport. But that vibration was definitely coming from the direction of the old tracks, and it was getting stronger. Harold stepped outside Murphy's Hardware and looked east toward the abandoned railway corridor. In the distance, beyond the tree line that marked Springfield's eastern boundary, he could see something that made his blood run cold. A thin column of black smoke was rising against the clear morning sky. 40 years of experience told Harold everything he needed to know. That wasn't the smoke of a controlled burn or industrial operation. That was the distinctive black smoke of emergency braking systems engaged at high speed, the smoke of a locomotive in serious trouble. Harold's hand instinctively reached for the cell phone in his coveralls pocket, but then he stopped, because something else had caught his attention, something that turned his concern into pure terror. The vibration wasn't slowing down. It was getting stronger, more intense, building toward something that Harold's experience told him was impossible. A runaway train was approaching Springfield at high speed, and based on the intensity of the vibrations, that train was massive, fast, and completely out of control. Harold pulled out his phone and dialed 911, but even as he waited for the dispatcher to answer, his mind was already racing ahead to calculations that no emergency responder would understand. Train speed based on vibration patterns, time to reach populated areas based on distance and terrain, probable cargo based on locomotive type and number of cars. When the dispatcher answered, Harold's voice was calm but urgent, carrying the authority of a man who had spent 40 years turning disaster into salvation. "This is Harold Thompson calling about an emergency railroad situation. You have a runaway freight train approaching Springfield from the east. Based on current speed and trajectory, you have approximately 35 minutes to begin evacuations of the downtown area." But even as Harold gave the warning, he knew that 35 minutes wouldn't be enough. By the time emergency responders mobilized, by the time evacuations began, by the time anyone understood the scope of the disaster approaching their city, it would be too late. 2 million people were about to face the greatest railroad disaster in American history. And the only person in Springfield with the knowledge and experience to prevent that disaster was a 67-year-old hardware store clerk who had promised himself that his days of risking everything to save strangers were over. The promise Harold had made to himself 3 years ago was about to collide with the promise he had made to Iron Horse McKinnon 40 years ago. And Harold Thompson was about to discover that some promises are stronger than others. Harold stood outside Murphy's hardware store, his cell phone still in his hand, watching the black smoke column grow larger against the morning sky. The dispatcher had hung up on him after he'd tried to explain the situation, but Harold couldn't blame her. How do you convince someone that a retired hardware store clerk knows more about train emergencies than the emergency response system? But Harold knew something that the dispatcher didn't. He knew that in situations like this, official response systems were designed for conventional problems. They were built around protocols, procedures, and equipment that worked wonderfully for normal emergencies. A runaway freight train carrying hazardous materials was not a normal emergency. Harold checked his watch. 7:47 a.m. Based on the vibration patterns and smoke characteristics, he estimated the train was traveling at approximately 80 miles per hour and was roughly 28 miles from Springfield's downtown area. That gave him 33 minutes before impact. 33 minutes to decide whether Harold Thompson, the peaceful hardware store clerk, would remain retired, or whether Harold Thompson, the train whisperer, would break his promise to himself and answer Iron Horse McKinnon's call one final time. Harold thought about Margaret, about the quiet life they had planned together, the retirement they had dreamed of, the grandchildren they had hoped to spoil. He thought about the promise he had made to himself 3 years ago. No more rescues, no more risking everything for strangers, no more carrying the weight of other people's lives on his shoulders. But then Harold thought about something else. He thought about Springfield Elementary School, where 847 children were probably starting their day with morning lessons. He thought about Memorial Hospital, where patients lay recovering in beds, unable to evacuate quickly if disaster struck. He thought about the apartment complexes, the nursing homes, the businesses where people were going about their normal Tuesday routines, completely unaware that death was approaching at 80 miles per hour. And Harold realized that some promises are more important than others. He walked back into Murphy's Hardware, grabbed a piece of paper from the counter, and wrote a quick note for Mike Murphy. Emergency situation. Had to leave. Will explain later. Harold. He taped the note to the cash register, locked the store, and walked to his pickup truck. As Harold drove toward the railroad corridor, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the familiar combination of terror and purpose that came with accepting responsibility for other people's lives. It was the feeling that had driven him through 40 years of railroad disasters, the feeling that Margaret had understood better than anyone, the feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, regardless of the personal cost. But this time was different. This time, Harold wasn't a young federal inspector with backup support and official authority. This time, he was a 67-year-old retiree with arthritis in his knees and a heart condition that his doctor kept warning him about. This time, if Harold failed, he wouldn't just be letting down the railroad industry or disappointing his supervisors. He would be breaking the most important promise of his life, the promise he had made to a dying man who had believed that some responsibilities transcend job descriptions, the promise that had shaped every day of Harold's 40-year career, the promise that was about to be tested in the most impossible circumstances Harold had ever faced. And as Harold drove toward what might be his final confrontation with an unstoppable train, he found himself speaking aloud to a man who had been dead for 37 years. "Well, Iron Horse," Harold said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to attempt, "looks like you're going to get that promise kept one more time." The Locomotive was a massive GEES 44AC, one of the most powerful freight engines ever built, pulling 51 cars behind it. Harold could see immediately that this wasn't just a runaway train. It was a chemical disaster waiting to happen. Tank cars marked with hazardous material placards rolled past his position, each one containing thousands of gallons of industrial chemicals that would turn into a toxic fireball if the train derailed at high speed. Through his binoculars, Harold could see into the locomotive cab. The engineer was slumped over the controls, clearly unconscious or worse. The radio was squawking with emergency communications, but no one was there to answer. Harold checked his watch. 14 minutes until the train reached Springfield's downtown district, where it would encounter a series of sharp curves that no locomotive could navigate at this speed. The derailment would happen right in the heart of the city, directly adjacent to Springfield Elementary School, Memorial Hospital, and 3 major apartment complexes. 2 million people lived in the potential blast radius. Harold made his decision. He drove his pickup truck parallel to the train, matching its speed on the service road that ran alongside the tracks. At 67 years old, with arthritis in his knees and a heart condition that his doctor kept warning him about, Harold Thompson prepared to do something that would have been dangerous for a man half his age. He was going to board a runaway train. The locomotive was traveling at 78 miles per hour when Harold made his move. He positioned his truck as close to the tracks as possible, rolled down his window, and waited for the exact moment when the cab's rear access ladder would be within reach. Harold had done this before, but that was 20 years ago, when his joints still worked properly and his reflexes were sharp. Now, he was asking his 67-year-old body to perform a feat that would challenge an Olympic athlete. The ladder flashed past his window. Harold lunged. His right hand caught the bottom rung just as his truck began to fall behind. For a terrifying moment, Harold's feet dragged along the gravel beside the tracks as he struggled to get his left hand onto the ladder. The locomotive's massive wheels thundered just inches away, and Harold knew that if he lost his grip, he wouldn't just fall, he would be pulled under 51 cars of unstoppable steel. Harold's grip held. Using strength he didn't know he still possessed, he pulled himself up onto the ladder and began the 20-foot climb to the locomotive's cab. Wind tore at his clothes and tried to rip him from the ladder, but Harold climbed steadily, drawing on muscle memory from thousands of locomotive inspections. When he reached the cab door, Harold could hear the chaos inside, radio traffic filled with panic, alarms blaring, and the distinctive sound of emergency brakes fighting against momentum and losing. Harold opened the door and stepped into the cab of a runaway train. Engineer Bill Crawford was alive but unconscious, slumped over the control panel with his hand still gripping the emergency brake lever. Harold quickly checked his pulse, steady but weak, probably a heart attack. The radio was screaming with emergency traffic from railroad dispatch, local police, and what sounded like federal agencies. Train is still approaching Springfield at high speed. Evacuation in progress, but we need more time. No one on board responding to radio contact. Harold grabbed the radio microphone. This is Harold Thompson, retired Federal Railroad Safety Inspector, now on board Locomotive 4471. I have an unconscious engineer and am taking emergency control of this train. The response was immediate. Sir, please identify yourself and state your credentials. Federal Inspector Badge Number 7741, 40 years experience, 3 previous emergency dynamic override activations. I am implementing EDO procedures now. There was a pause, then a different voice came on the radio, calmer, more authoritative. Inspector Thompson, this is Railroad Operations Control. We show you approaching Springfield city limits. What is your status? Harold looked at the speedometer, 84 miles per hour. The regular brakes were glowing red hot and beginning to fail. Through the windshield he could see the outskirts of Springfield approaching fast. Speed 84 and climbing, regular brakes failing, engineer unconscious. I'm beginning EDO sequence now. Inspector, be advised that EDO has never been attempted on a train of this weight at this speed. Harold was already moving toward the control panel. Then I guess we're about to find out if it works. Emergency dynamic override was not a simple procedure. It required shutting down the locomotive's primary power systems while simultaneously engaging regenerative braking that would turn the train's massive electric motors into generators, creating electromagnetic resistance that could slow even the heaviest freight train. The danger was that if the procedure failed, Harold would lose all control of the locomotive, including steering and basic safety systems. The train would become a completely uncontrolled projectile, and Harold would be trapped in the cab when it inevitably derailed. But Harold had something that no manual could teach and no training could replicate: an intuitive understanding of how locomotives behaved under extreme stress. He had spent 40 years listening to trains, feeling their vibrations, learning to read their mechanical moods like a musician reads sheet music. As Harold's hands moved across the control panel, he wasn't following a checklist. He was conducting a symphony of steel and electricity, using touch and sound to guide decisions that computer systems couldn't make. Shutting down primary traction motors, he announced into the radio. The locomotive's massive diesel engine wound down, and suddenly the only sounds were wind, the click of wheels on rails, and the increasingly desperate squeal of overheated brakes. Engaging regenerative braking sequence. Harold flipped a series of switches that most engineers would never see in their entire careers. Deep in the locomotive's electrical systems, circuits designed for emergency use only began redirecting power from the motors to a massive resistance grid. The effect was immediate. Harold felt the locomotive shudder as electromagnetic forces began fighting against the train's momentum. The speedometer needle stopped climbing and held steady at 86 miles per hour. We have initial deceleration, Harold reported, beginning secondary sequence. Springfield's downtown skyline was visible now, less than 5 miles ahead. Harold could see the sharp curve where the railroad crossed Maple Street right next to the elementary school. At current speed, the locomotive would never make that turn. Harold activated the final stage of emergency dynamic override. Every electric motor in the 51-car train suddenly became a generator. The massive resistance created was like dropping an anchor made of pure physics. The locomotive lurched forward as if it had hit an invisible wall, then began to slow with startling effectiveness. Dispatch, local police, and what sounded like federal agencies. Train is still approaching Springfield at high speed. Evacuation in progress, but we need more time. No one on board responding to radio contact. Harold grabbed the radio microphone. This is Harold Thompson, retired Federal Railroad Safety Inspector, now on board Locomotive 4471. I have an unconscious engineer and am taking emergency control of this train. The response was immediate. Sir, please identify yourself and state your credentials. Federal Inspector Badge Number 7741, 40 years experience, 3 previous emergency dynamic override activations. I am implementing EDO procedures now. There was a pause, then a different voice came on the radio, calmer, more authoritative. Inspector Thompson, this is Railroad Operations Control. We show you approaching Springfield city limits. What is your status? Harold looked at the speedometer, 84 miles per hour. The regular brakes were glowing red hot and beginning to fail. Through the windshield he could see the outskirts of Springfield approaching fast. Speed 84 and climbing, regular brakes failing, engineer unconscious. I'm beginning EDO sequence now. Inspector, be advised that EDO has never been attempted on a train of this weight at this speed. Harold was already moving toward the control panel. Then I guess we're about to find out if it works. Emergency dynamic override was not a simple procedure. It required shutting down the locomotive's primary power systems while simultaneously engaging regenerative braking that would turn the train's massive electric motors into generators, creating electromagnetic resistance that could slow even the heaviest freight train. The danger was that if the procedure failed, Harold would lose all control of the locomotive, including steering and basic safety systems. The train would become a completely uncontrolled projectile, and Harold would be trapped in the cab when it inevitably derailed. But Harold had something that no manual could teach and no training could replicate: an intuitive understanding of how locomotives behaved under extreme stress. He had spent 40 years listening to trains, feeling their vibrations, learning to read their mechanical moods like a musician reads sheet music. As Harold's hands moved across the control panel, he wasn't following a checklist. He was conducting a symphony of steel and electricity, using touch and sound to guide decisions that computer systems couldn't make. Shutting down primary traction motors, he announced into the radio. The locomotive's massive diesel engine wound down, and suddenly the only sounds were wind, the click of wheels on rails, and the increasingly desperate squeal of overheated brakes. Engaging regenerative braking sequence. Harold flipped a series of switches that most engineers would never see in their entire careers. Deep in the locomotive's electrical systems, circuits designed for emergency use only began redirecting power from the motors to a massive resistance grid. The effect was immediate. Harold felt the locomotive shudder as electromagnetic forces began fighting against the train's momentum. The speedometer needle stopped climbing and held steady at 86 miles per hour. We have initial deceleration, Harold reported, beginning secondary sequence. Springfield's downtown skyline was visible now, less than 5 miles ahead. Harold could see the sharp curve where the railroad crossed Maple Street right next to the elementary school. At current speed, the locomotive would never make that turn. Harold activated the final stage of emergency dynamic override. Every electric motor in the 51-car train suddenly became a generator. The massive resistance created was like dropping an anchor made of pure physics. The locomotive lurched forward as if it had hit an invisible wall, then began to slow with startling effectiveness. Harold explained to a congressional committee investigating railroad safety. If proper emergency systems had been in place, if newer engineers had been trained in old-school troubleshooting techniques, that train would never have become a runaway in the first place. But the most important change was quieter and more personal. Engineering schools began inviting retired railroad workers to teach courses in practical locomotive management. Railroad companies started pairing young engineers with experienced retirees for advanced training. And across America, people began to look at their own retired neighbors with new respect, wondering what knowledge and experience might be quietly living next door. 3 months after the train rescue, Harold Thompson was back to his routine at Murphy's hardware store. He arrived at 7 a.m., organized inventory, helped customers find the right parts, and left at 3 p.m. to avoid the afternoon rush. The only difference was that customers now approached him with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Word had spread throughout Springfield about what their quiet hardware store worker had really done, and while Harold never talked about the rescue, people seemed to stand a little straighter in his presence. "Mr. Thompson," said young Jamie Patterson, whose mother worked at the elementary school that would have been destroyed if the train had derailed. "My mom says you're a hero." Harold looked up from the bin of screws he was organizing. "Your mom's very kind, but I just did my job. The real heroes are people like your mom who teach children and help them grow up to make the world better." "But you saved everyone," Harold smiled. "Everyone saves everyone, Jamie. We all take care of each other. That's how the world works." At 3 p.m., Harold locked up the store and walked to his pickup truck. As he drove home through the streets of Springfield, he passed the elementary school where children played safely on the playground, the hospital where patients recovered in peace, and the apartment buildings where families went about their daily lives. None of them would ever know how close they had come to disaster. None of them needed to know. That was the point of being a hero. Not to be recognized, but to ensure that recognition was never necessary. Harold parked in his driveway, checked his mail, and went inside to prepare dinner. Tomorrow he would wake up at 6:30 a.m., drive to the hardware store, and help people find whatever they needed to fix whatever was broken. It was a quiet life, an unremarkable life, the kind of life that most people would consider ordinary. But Harold Thompson had learned long ago that the most extraordinary thing a person could do was to be exactly where they were needed, when they were needed, with the skills and courage to help. The Springfield train rescue lasted 47 minutes from the moment Harold first felt the vibrations in the hardware store floor to the moment the locomotive came to a complete stop. In that time, one man's lifetime of knowledge and experience prevented what would have been one of the worst industrial disasters in American history. But the real lesson of Harold Thompson's story isn't about trains or technical expertise or even heroism in the traditional sense. It's about the value of experience, the importance of preparation, and the quiet courage that comes from simply knowing what needs to be done and doing it. Harold never set out to be a hero. He set out to be competent, knowledgeable, and available when his skills were needed. He spent 40 years learning everything he could about locomotives, not because he expected to save cities, but because that was his job and he believed in doing it well. When the moment came that tested everything he had learned, Harold was ready not because he was special, but because he had made himself useful. He had paid attention, gained experience, and most importantly, never stopped caring about doing the right thing. In a world that often celebrates flash and spectacle, Harold Thompson's story reminds us that the most important heroes are often the quietest ones. They don't seek attention or recognition. They just know things, can do things, and when crisis comes, they step forward and solve problems that everyone else thinks are impossible. They work in hardware stores and drive old pickup trucks and wear coveralls instead of uniforms. And when you need them most, they're exactly where they're supposed to be, ready to do exactly what needs to be done. Harold Thompson's story didn't end when the train stopped safely outside Springfield. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. Because what Harold had accomplished that day wasn't just a rescue. It was proof that the promise he had made to Iron Horse McKinnon 40 years earlier was more than just words spoken to a dying man. It was a covenant that transcended time, age, and circumstance. 3 months after the Springfield rescue, Harold received a letter that would change his quiet retirement forever. It came from the newly formed National Railroad Emergency Response Team, a federal program created in response to Harold's heroic actions. Mr. Thompson, the letter read, we are writing to invite you to lead a new initiative that will ensure what happened in Springfield never happens again. We want to create a network of retired railroad professionals who can provide emergency response expertise when conventional systems fail. Harold read the letter 3 times, sitting in his kitchen with Margaret's coffee mug in his hands. The program they were describing was exactly what Iron Horse McKinnon had envisioned when he spoke about passing knowledge to the next generation. But Harold had learned something important during his 3 years of retirement. True heroism wasn't about accepting official positions or leading government programs. True heroism was about being available when people needed you most, whether that meant stopping runaway trains or helping customers find the right screws. Harold wrote back, declining the leadership position but offering something even more valuable. He would help train a new generation of railroad emergency responders, not as an official instructor, but as a quiet mentor who would pass on the knowledge that books couldn't teach. Today, Harold still works at Murphy's hardware store, but twice a month, young railroad engineers make the pilgrimage to Springfield to learn from the man who stopped an unstoppable train. They don't come for official certification or government credentials. They come to learn the secrets that only experience can teach. And every Tuesday at 7:43 a.m., Harold steps outside the hardware store and listens to the morning silence, remembering the day when the earth shook, and he answered a call that had been waiting 40 years to be heard. Because some promises are too important to be kept just once. Some promises are meant to be renewed every day, in every act of service, in every moment when someone chooses to help rather than walk away. Iron Horse McKinnon's promise lives on in Harold Thompson. And someday, when Harold is too old to climb onto runaway trains, that promise will live on in someone else, someone who learned that true heroism isn't about being extraordinary. It's about being prepared when extraordinary things are required of ordinary people. Welcome to True Hero Stories, where the most important promises are the ones we make to each other, and the greatest heroes are the ones who keep those promises, no matter how long it takes or how much it costs.